Alright, this is going to be the shortest video of the year. That's my goal. First half of chapter 25, the key word is industry. So it's all about industry, industrialization. It's a key word in the Gilded Age, the late 1800s. And here are some of the key topics we're going to get at. The railroad is one of the biggest things of the Gilded Age. It's a must know. This law you need to know, the Interstate Commerce Act. So all these things right here are very important. There's some key terms that we're going to highlight in the video. Alright, the two most important things in this section are right here. After the Civil War, railroad production grew enormously. This is such an important thing. It highlights the importance of the railroad. And the second thing is the railroad companies got a lot of land from Congress. So they were able to build their railroads because of Congress, and they were able to get land that they could eventually sell and make a ton of money off of. Okay, the next section is about the Transcontinental Railroad. A couple things you need to highlight. The Union Pacific, this is the company that built the Transcontinental Railroad westward from Omaha, Nebraska. And then out west was the Central Pacific, and they built the Transcontinental Railroad eastward, and they were made up of Chinese workers. So the Chinese worked on the Central Pacific in California, and the Irish mostly built the railroad for the Union Pacific in Nebraska. All right, to highlight this, 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was finally completed, and by 1869, California is connected with the rest of the United States. All right, most important thing is this bullet right here. Many businessmen overinvested or over-speculated in land. The banks that supported the railroad projects, many of them failed, and so there was a lot of investment failures. And this right here, the over-speculation of land, the failure of banks, loaning out too much money, led to the Panic of 1873. All right, so then in this chapter, there are some names you need to know, and you have to associate their invention or what they made their money in, because these names we're going to talk about were super, super rich. And the first name is Cornelius Vanderbilt. So the name is Vanderbilt. Associate that with railroad companies, and he became so rich off the railroad companies. Railroads did improve during the Gilded Age over time, and I would just mention this. The Pullman Palace car, we'll look at a photograph here in a second, but basically people can now travel on trains in style and in comfort. And lastly, just remember this name Pullman, okay, because there's a famous strike that's called the Pullman Strike, and it's basically named after the guy who invented these palace cars. We'll get to that in a later chapter. Okay, I cannot stress the importance of the railroad. To me, they're the key industry of the Gilded Age. I associate them to like the automobile of the 20th century. The railroads were key in this late 1800s time period. Second and third was probably steel, the second most important industry, and then third was probably oil. And perhaps you remember the Americans that made a ton of money in steel and oil. We'll get to them in a little bit. All right, so the railroads are so important in so many ways. They help drive the market economy, provide lots of jobs for people, easy for transportation, helped our industries grow. So it's just so important to develop the industrialized country that the United States became during the late 1800s. Okay, so don't underestimate the railroad and realize that the railroads were bad, bad people. Corruption, I am not a fan. It really bothers me when I think about the railroads, so I'm going to try to calm down. Okay, I did. Scandal did happen with many of the railroads. The most famous one is the Credit Mobilier that happened during, which president? Grant's presidency. I'm not going to go into detail with some of this stuff, but there was people that were very corrupt that had dealings with the railroad and made a ton of money off them. A lot of bribery, a lot of just very corrupt things. I think the railroad companies were the most corrupt thing in the late 1800s. And I think the best example or evidence to show that is right here. The railroad companies would give cheaper rates for longer distances than shorter ones. So if you needed to travel a short distance on the railroad, it cost you more money than if you had to travel across the country, which makes no sense. But the people that benefit from this were the wealthier business owners. They benefit from this because they're the ones that were transporting things long distances. So the smaller farmer who just needed to travel a short distance had to pay more and were treated unfairly. All right, so hopefully you're starting to realize the railroads were corrupt problems, not really good for America in a lot of ways, and the government had to do something to stop the corrupt practices and the unfair treatment by the railroad. And so this group called the Grange, we'll get to them in a later chapter, but the Grange was one of the first organizations for farmers, and it tried to organize farmers and try to fight back against the corruption of the railroad The connection to make is that the Grange and farmers in general out west despised the railroads. Okay, some states did try to control the railroad, but could not. So it came down to the federal government. Highlight this, a must-know in APUSH. The Interstate Commerce Act in 1887 was very important. It was really one of the first steps of the federal government to try to stop the corruption and abuses of the railroad. So when you see Interstate Commerce Act, think of the railroads. Now, the railroad companies did continue a lot of their evil ways, but this law is the first step or the first attempt of the federal government to regulate big business, and it's a step in the right direction to help the poor in America. All right, so the next section. Before the Civil War, the United States was the fourth largest manufacturing company. By 1894, we were number one. So what caused this dramatic increase in manufacturing in America? And here are all the reasons, okay? And they all kind of make sense. We did already have some rather wealthy people that could help create factories. Our vast land area had many natural resources, iron ore, petroleum, massive immigration during this time period. We'll get to this later in the chapter. So immigration allowed for cheap labor in the factories. And another thing, unfortunately, and I'll give it a little bit of credit, is the railroad did bind our country together and allowed for this explosion of industrialization in America. Okay, so now we're going to talk about some of the problems of this industrialized society. We already mentioned the corruption of the railroad. Now we're going to talk about some very, 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 very rich people. Carnegie and Rockefeller, oh my, there's more we're going to talk about. But I want you to know how they made their money. Andrew Carnegie made his money in steel. You need to know that. And his process was called vertical integration. And basically, Carnegie controlled the entire steelmaking process. He owned everything, the mines, the railroads, the factories, and so on. And so he was able to have a monopoly of steel. John D. Rockefeller, who I cannot stand the most. I think he's number one enemy maybe in American history. He is just Scrooge. He is all about money and wealth. He's not about relationships. Carnegie, I kind of like more. We'll get to that later. But Rockefeller made his money in oil. So highlight Rockefeller oil, and he used horizontal integration. And instead of owning the whole process of the oil producing industry, Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller, bought out his competition. And he truly had a monopoly. And his monopoly of oil was called Standard Oil Company. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about steel. When you think of steel and APUSH, you have to think of Andrew Carnegie. Okay, and we're going to read about him and have a discussion about him. He was the titan of steel in America. And steel became so important because of a process called the Beamer process. Oh, I'm sorry, not the Beamer process, the Bessemer process. And you don't have to know exactly what it is, like the whole specifics of it. But basically, they turned iron into steel, okay, by using cold air. So this is how they're able to make a bunch of steel. And because the United States had a lot of coal in America, we could use that as fuel in our factories to turn the iron into steel. All right, so we're going to continue talking about steel, and of course, Carnegie. There he is. Look at that face. He's so happy. I'm king of the world. He's actually like the captain of the Titanic. Look at that smile, Santa. No, this guy, is that Rockefeller? No, that is J.P. Morgan. Not a fan of him. Like him? No. Okay, all right, so let's talk about Carnegie. Again, he made his money in steel. And his background's interesting. He started out very poor. He was an immigrant boy from Scotland, and he rose his way up to become one of the richest men in American history. We like to think that the Carnegie story is the rags to riches story, the American dream. This other guy here, his name is J.P. Morgan, okay, and he was just as rich as Carnegie, and he made his money in banking. So we know that Carnegie makes his money in steel. J.P. Morgan, this guy right here, makes his money in banking, and eventually he is so rich he's able to buy out Carnegie's steel company, and so he becomes the owner of U.S. Steel after 1900. Then the final thing I would highlight this is the gospel of wealth, okay, and this is associated with Andrew Carnegie, and he wrote this idea basically saying that the rich in America have to become philanthropists. The rich have to make society better, and so he donated a bunch of his money, millions of dollars, 90% of his wealth, he donated to libraries, schools, and foundations to make America a better place. And his philosophy was called the gospel of wealth. All right, I guess I have to talk about John D. Rockefeller. I don't, but I have to, and no, I don't. I'm not a fan. Okay, so Rockefeller grows an American beauty rose what does this even mean? It took me 5 years to finally figure out an American Beauty rose is the perfect rose. How do you get the perfect rose? You have to destroy all the rose buds before, all the petals below it to have the perfect thing, and that's what he does. He destroys, I think, basically America to become the richest person ever in American history, ever. Okay, you know what? I'm done talking about him. You got to read this section, read this. I'm not talking about Rockefeller anymore. Hey, you get to talk about the Gospel of Wealth again. That's so exciting. All right, so again, the Gospel of Wealth, you got to think about Andrew Carnegie. This is what he wrote. He penned this idea that the wealthy had to support society. And this definition that you can kind of read it, and it kind of goes over the responsibility of the wealthy to make society better. Okay, this is called the Gospel of Wealth. Another term you should highlight is social Darwinism. Okay, and this doesn't really associate well with the Gospel of Wealth. This philosophy is like the survival of the fittest, and it kind of is associated with Darwin's theory of evolution, basically that the strong will survive. And so, in America, the rich in America use social Darwinism to justify their enormous amount of wealth because it's the survival of the fittest. In a capitalist society, the rich deserve everything they get, and so this is their philosophy to justify their enormous amount of wealth. And finally, I just wanted to highlight this term, plutocracy. Maybe you've seen this before. It has nothing to do with the former planet of Pluto, but plutocracy refers to the wealthy. And back in the day when my wife was a cheerleader, they would have a cheerocracy to decide all their situations. Yeah, final slide, and we need to highlight something. You need to highlight the year 1890. There's that year again, 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act, another must-know and A push. And so this law is passed that basically tried to break up trusts in America. The Antitrust Act, break up monopolies, and this is what it was supposed to do. Basically, it was supposed to prevent trusts, which is another term for monopolies, but this was in fact ineffective. Okay, the Sherman Antitrust Act was not enforced by the federal government, so this law was a good idea to try to prevent monopolies, but it was not effective. In fact, the people who were probably most supportive of this law were workers or factory workers and common citizens. The Sherman Antitrust Act actually went against the factory workers because this law was used to break up unions. The labor unions of the factory workers were broken up by the Sherman Antitrust Act. So it definitely backfired, especially against the poor in America. However, by 1914, during the progressive movement, this law will be replaced by the Clayton Antitrust Act, which basically puts a lot more teeth and truly breaks up monopolies and trusts in America. So today there are no monopolies, or there cannot be a monopoly in America because of the Clayton Antitrust Act, but the beginning seed was planted in 1890 with the Sherman Antitrust Act.